The man grabbed the little girl's arm so hard she cried out. Not a warning, not a firm hand. A yank, the kind that leaves bruises shaped like fingers. The kind that makes grown men look away because they don't want to get involved. He was the town sheriff of Coldwater Bluff, badge polished bright as his cruelty, and he stood in the middle of the mud street dragging a 7-year-old toward her weeping mother like she was stolen property. You people ain't welcome here, he snarled at the heavy-set woman in the wagon. Move on before I find a reason to make you. The woman's face went white, then red. She climbed down from that wagon with her bad knee and her worn boots, and she put herself between the badge and her daughter without a single word of hesitation. That was Hazel Rowan. And watching from the tree line on the edge of town, hidden as he always was, as he'd trained himself to be, was a man who hadn't set foot among people in 8 years. A man who told himself he didn't care anymore. He was wrong. If you've ever been pushed out of a place you desperately needed, if you've ever watched someone protect a child with nothing but sheer, stubborn love, this story is going to stay with you. Subscribe right now and follow this story to the end, because every part of this is going to hit somewhere deep. And before you go, drop a like, leave a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the mountain where it all began. The scar started just below Silas Boone's left ear and ran its ragged course down his jaw, across his throat, and disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt like something that didn't want to be seen. He understood that feeling better than most. He'd been disappearing himself for the better part of a decade. He was 41 years old, though he couldn't have told you that with any certainty. Years had stopped meaning much somewhere around the 3rd winter alone. What he knew with precision were other things. The weight of a properly set trap, the smell of a coming snowstorm, at least 6 hours before it arrived, the exact number of logs it took to keep a cabin above freezing through a night that dropped to 20 below. These were the things that mattered. These were the things that kept a man alive when nothing else was trying to. Silas had not always lived this way. There had been a town, once, a family of a kind, a mother who died when he was 12, a father who drank himself mean and stayed that way until a horse put him out of everyone's misery, a younger brother named Cal who'd had their mother's eyes and absolutely none of her sense. And there had been a fire. Not a metaphorical one, not the kind people talk about when they mean passion or ambition. An actual fire. A barn. A lantern knocked over in the dark. Cal screaming somewhere in the smoke. Silas going in after him. He got Cal out. He didn't get out whole. The doctors in the nearest town had done what they could, which wasn't much. They'd kept him alive with some apparent reluctance and sent him back into the world wearing a face that made strangers flinch, and children cry, and women cross the street. He'd tried. He wanted people to understand that, though there was no one left to explain himself to. He had tried. He'd stayed in that town for 2 years after the fire, working the livery, keeping his head down, speaking when spoken to, which wasn't often. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that lives in a crowd, and it is far worse than the kind you find in silence. Every averted eye, every conversation that stopped when he walked in, every woman who smiled too carefully, the way you smile at something you feel sorry for. He stopped trying. He loaded what he could carry onto a mule named Patience, a name he'd given her ironically because she had none. And he went up into the Cradle Mountains, which is what the old-timers called the range of granite peaks that jutted up from the high country northwest of everywhere that mattered. He built his cabin with his own hands, which took 1 full summer and was frankly terrible carpentry, and he trapped through the winter, and he cured hides, and he traded once a season at an outpost down the mountain that asked no questions because the man who ran it, old Declan Marsh, had long since lost interest in other people's stories. 8 winters. He'd lost count of how many elk he'd skinned. He knew exactly how many people he'd spoken to in a calendar year, usually somewhere between 4 and 9, counting Declan, and some years Declan was the only one. He did not think of himself as unhappy. That's the thing people don't understand about isolation. After a certain point, it stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like weather. You just exist inside it. You stop noticing the cold. He noticed it again the morning of the storm. He'd come down the east slope to check his lower trapline, which ran along a frozen creek bed through a stand of spruce that dropped into a narrow valley. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the trail that cut through that valley. It was the long route west, used mostly by settlers heading further into the frontier, and he had no reason to be near it. But one of his traps had been sprung and dragged, and the drag marks led him down further than he liked to go, and that's when he heard it. A sound he hadn't heard in a long time. A child crying. Not the panicked kind, not screaming, the worst kind. The low, exhausted kind that means the child has been crying for a while and has mostly given up expecting it to change anything. Silas stopped walking. He stood very still the way he'd learned to stand, barely breathing, listening past the creek noise and the wind in the spruce boughs. And then he heard a second sound, a woman's voice, low and steady, saying something he couldn't make out. And then a sound that he recognized from experience, the groan and crack of a wagon axle giving way. He should have turned around. He knew the moment he started moving toward the sound, rather than away from it, that he was making a mistake. He'd made the same kind of mistake once before, running into a burning barn. He was beginning to suspect that this particular character flaw was not going to improve with age. The wagon had come off the trail at the worst possible angle. The left rear wheel had dropped into a rut hidden under a crust of old snow, and the axle had snapped. Not bent, snapped, clean through, which meant it hadn't been in great condition to begin with. The wagon sat at a miserable tilt, cargo shifted hard to one side, and a large bay horse stood in the traces looking profoundly disgusted with the whole situation. The woman was already on the ground, crouched beside the broken axle, and she was not wringing her hands and waiting for rescue. She was examining the break with focused, professional attention, running her fingers along the fracture line the way a doctor examines a wound. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, heavy-set, wearing a canvas coat that had seen better years and heavy boots caked with mud. Her dark hair was pulled back and mostly escaping whatever was holding it. Her face, when she turned it slightly, showed the kind of lines that come from weather and worry in roughly equal measure. He put her somewhere in her middle 30s. The little girl was sitting on a rock nearby, wrapped in a quilt that was too big for her, holding herself together with the particular rigid dignity of a child who has decided crying is no longer helping. She had her mother's dark hair and very large eyes, and she was watching her mother the way a compass needle watches north. Silas watched from the trees. He told himself he was just assessing the situation. He told himself he'd make sure they were not in immediate danger and then leave. He told himself a lot of things. "The axle's gone," the woman said, not to him. She hadn't seen him yet, but apparently to herself, or to the wagon, or to the universe in general. Her voice was even, no tears in it, just information. "It's gone, and I've got half a repair kit and no forge." "Mama," the little girl said, "is it bad?" "It's fixable," the woman said, with the automatic confidence of someone who says that about everything whether or not they believe it. "That's not what I asked." The woman looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she almost smiled, just the edge of it. "It's bad," she admitted, "but it's still fixable." That was when she looked up and saw him. To her credit, she didn't scream. Most people screamed, or at least made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, a step backward, some involuntary communication of horror. The woman with the broken wagon looked at Silas Boone standing at the tree line with his scarred face and his heavy coat and his rifle over his shoulder, and her expression went through several things very quickly: surprise, assessment, calculation, and settled somewhere that he did not immediately recognize because he so rarely saw it directed at him. She looked at him like he was useful. "You know these mountains?" she asked. He blinked. "What?" "These mountains." She gestured broadly at everything. "You know them? You live up here?" "Yes." "Is there shelter nearby? Storm's coming." She glanced at the sky with the quick certainty of someone who'd learned to read weather the hard way. "Coming fast?" Silas looked at the sky. She was right. He'd smelled it since morning. The particular heaviness in the air, the way sound carried differently, the way the spruce tips had been trembling in no apparent wind since before sunrise. Not a small storm, the kind that could kill you if you were caught in the open. "My cabin," he said, 2 miles up the east slope. "Can the horse make it?" "In 2 hours, yes. In 3, probably not." She stood up from beside the broken axle and she looked at him directly and without flinching, which people almost never did, and she said, I'm Hazel Rowan. That's my daughter Nora. I can't pay you money because I don't have much. But I've got cured venison, good rope, and I'm not a complaining guest. Would you take us to your cabin until this storm passes and I can figure out the axle?" He stared at her. In 8 years, no one had ever asked him for anything this directly. They asked with their eyes, and he pretended not to notice. They asked through Declan Marsh with vague mentions of the fella up the mountain. They didn't just stand in front of him in the snow and ask. "Mama," the little girl said from her rock still wrapped in the quilt. She was looking at Silas now, not with fear, with the pure, unbothered curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to perform discomfort to make adults feel better. "Is that man going to help us?" "I don't know yet," Hazel said. "I'm asking him." "He looks like he's been in a fight," Nora said. Silas didn't say anything. "Nora," Hazel said with a tone that was not quite warning. "A really bad fight," Nora continued, with the conviction of a child completing a thought. "Did you win?" Something happened in Silas's chest that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pain exactly. It was more like the absence of pain for just a second, which after a while can feel the same. "Grab the horse," he said. "I'll take what I can carry from the wagon. Leave the rest covered. We need to move." Hazel Rowan did not say thank you right away, which he respected. She just nodded once and turned to start unhitching the bay from the tilted wagon with practiced, capable hands. No wasted motion, no hesitation. He found out later she'd been a blacksmith's wife and had worked the forge beside her husband from the first year of their marriage. He found out later that her husband had died of fever 2 years prior and had left her the wagon, the horse, a modest collection of tools, and a 7-year-old girl with her mother's stubbornness tripled. He didn't know any of that yet, climbing the east slope with a stranger's pack on his back and a child walking determinedly beside him who had declared entirely without being invited to that she would hold his hand on the steep parts so he didn't get scared. "I don't get scared," he said. "Everyone gets scared on the steep parts," Nora said, with the certainty of someone who has thought about this. "Mama does. She just doesn't make a face." "I don't make a face either. You're making one right now." He was. He was aware of it. He just couldn't quite stop. The wind picked up about a mile from the cabin, and it picked up mean, not gradually but all at once, the way mountain storms announce themselves when they've stopped being patient. Snow began, horizontal and serious, and the temperature dropped hard enough that Silas felt it through his coat, which meant it was dropping fast. Hazel pulled Nora against her side without breaking stride and put her head down and kept walking, and he realized he had underestimated how strong her legs were. She was keeping pace with him over rocky ground and deteriorating visibility, and she was doing it without complaint. He pushed the pace anyway. The cabin, when it finally emerged from the white, looked exactly like what it was. A structure built by a man with limited carpentry skills and unlimited determination. Low-roofed, thick-walled, with a stone chimney that leaned at an angle that should have been alarming but had proven structurally sound for 8 years running. There was a lean-to on the south side for patients, who regarded the new horse with deep personal suspicion, and a woodpile that was, by precise calculation, large enough for exactly the winter he'd planned for. Not for 3. He stood at the door and looked at the woodpile and did the math, and did not like the results. "It's a good cabin," Hazel said behind him. He turned. She was looking at it with the same frank assessment she'd turned on the broken axle, cataloging what was there, what was missing, what could be worked with. "It's sufficient," he said. "It's good," she repeated, and she meant it as something real, not politeness. He opened the door and let them in out of the storm, and somewhere outside the wind found a full howl and held it, and the snow came down like the sky had been waiting for exactly this moment to let go of everything it had been holding. The cabin had 1 room, 1 fireplace, 1 table, 2 chairs, a sleeping cot against the north wall, and 8 years of accumulated solitude so thick it was practically furniture. Nora walked in, looked around with complete confidence, and announced, "This is going to be cozy." Silas built the fire back up and did not say a word because there was no word for what he was feeling. Not exactly. Somewhere between alarm and something that had no right to be there at all. something that felt uncomfortably, stubbornly, against all good sense, like relief. He pushed it down. He was good at that. What he was less good at was what came next. What Hazel said that first evening, when Nora had fallen asleep curled by the fire wrapped in the quilt, and the storm had settled in like it owned the mountain, and the silence between the two adults was the particular kind that requires someone to eventually break it. She broke it. "I want to be straight with you," she said, her voice low so as not to wake the girl. "I'm not going to be trouble. I'm not going to be needy. I don't expect things from people who don't owe me anything, and you don't owe me anything." He looked at her across the table. "But I want you to know something," she continued. "What you did today, coming out of those trees when you could have stayed hidden, that wasn't nothing. I know what it costs a person to step forward when they're used to stepping back. I know that better than most." He didn't ask what she meant. He filed it away. "We'll be out of your way as soon as the storm breaks," she said. "Might be 3 days," he said. "Maybe 4. She nodded. "Then I'll be useful for 3 or 4 days. You'll see." He almost believed her. He believed the part about being useful. That was already evident. The other part, the part about leaving, that he believed too, logically. People always left. That was not new information. What was new was the specific way the cabin felt different with 2 other people breathing in it. The way the fire sounded different. The way Nora's small shape by the hearth was the most particular and undeniable proof that the world still contained things that were soft and that ought to be protected. He hadn't thought about protecting anything but himself in a long time. That thought stayed with him all night, long after Hazel had taken the cot over his objections. He slept on the floor and meant it when he said he preferred it, which was its own kind of sad truth. And Nora had burrowed under her quilt, and Patience had made her displeasure about the new horse known through the wall with a series of pointed stamps. He lay on the floor in the dark and listened to the storm take the mountain apart and put it back wrong, and for the first time in a long time, he couldn't name the sound of the silence between the gusts. It wasn't empty. That was the thing. For the first time in 8 years, the silence inside the cabin wasn't empty. He didn't know yet whether that was going to be wonderful or absolutely devastating. He was about to find out it was both. The first morning came gray and loud. Silas was already up when Hazel opened her eyes, had been up for over an hour, in fact, sitting at the table in the dark with a cup of something that had been coffee 3 weeks ago, and was now mostly habit in a tin cup. He'd watched the fire burn down and built it back up twice, and he'd listened to the storm work itself into a new pitch somewhere around 3 in the morning. And he had not slept more than 40 minutes total, which was not unusual for him when conditions changed. He slept light as a cat on normal nights. On nights when 2 strangers were breathing in his cabin, he apparently didn't sleep at all. He heard Hazel before he saw her move, a shift in her breathing, a small sound, the particular quality of wakefulness entering a room. She sat up on the cot and looked around for half a second with the disoriented eyes of someone recalibrating, and then her eyes found the room, found Nora still asleep on the floor by the fire, found Silas at the table, and she nodded. That was all. Just a nod, like they'd been doing this for years. He didn't know what to do with that. "How bad is it?" she asked, meaning the storm. "Bad enough," he said. "Wind shifted east an hour ago. That usually means another 6 to 8 hours minimum." She got up and went to the small window and looked out at the white nothing pressing against the glass. Her hair was down. He hadn't seen it down before, thick and dark and tangled from sleep. And she raked it back with both hands in a motion so unself-conscious that he looked away. 3 days, you said. Maybe more. She turned from the window and looked at the cabin the way she'd looked at it last night, cataloging, calculating. He'd noticed that about her. She didn't look at things the way most people did, which was to see them and move on. She looked at them the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood, like she was seeing the problem inside the thing and already figuring the fix. "Your north wall," she said. "What about it?" "It's leaking cold, not through the wood. The chinking's gone loose between the second and third log from the floor on the east end. You can see daylight in summer through a gap like that. In weather like this, it's bleeding heat you can't afford to lose." He looked at the north wall. He'd known about the gap. He'd been meaning to get to it since September, and had not gotten to it because he lived alone, and there was always something else, and no one suffered the consequences of his procrastination but himself. "I noticed," he said. "I can fix it if you've got the material. I don't need you to fix my wall." "I know you don't need me to," she said, with a patience that was not patience exactly, but something more like precision. "I'm going to go crazy sitting still for 3 days, and I'm not going to watch your firewood disappear through a gap in the chinking and not say something. So if you've got the material, I'd like to fix your wall, not for you, for my own peace of mind." He looked at her for a moment. "There's a bag of clay mix under the workbench outside," he said, "frozen solid. I'll thaw it by the fire. That'll take 2 hours. Then I'll start now." She was already putting her coat on. He watched her go out into the edge of the storm to find the clay bag, watched through the window as she pushed against the wind with her head down and her shoulders set, and came back in 40 seconds later with a frozen bag of clay mix tucked under her arm like a loaf of bread. And he felt something he recognized distantly as the early stages of being humbled. Nora woke up while the clay was thawing and immediately demanded to know 3 things: where she was, what was for breakfast, and whether the big horse outside was doing all right. Her priorities were stated in exactly that order, and Silas found himself answering all 3 before he'd made the conscious decision to speak to a 7-year-old before he'd had a second cup of near coffee. "You're in the cabin. There's oats and dried apple. The horse is fine." Nora considered this. "What's the horse's name?" "Doesn't have one." She stared at him. "You have a horse with no name?" "Mule." "You have a mule with no name?" "Her name is Patience." "That's a funny name for a mule." "It's an ironic name." Nora looked at her mother, who was crouched by the fire monitoring the clay bag. "Mama, what does ironic mean?" "It means the name is the opposite of what the thing is," Hazel said, without looking up. Nora looked back at Silas with something approaching delight. "So Patience has no patience?" "Correct." "I like her already," Nora said. He made oats. It wasn't complicated. He had a rhythm for it, a specific sequence involving the iron pot and a precise amount of water that he'd arrived at through trial and significant error over 8 years, and the result was functional, if not pleasant. He set it on the table and looked at it, and then, after a pause that probably lasted too long, went and found the dried apple and added it, which he would not have done if it were just himself. Nora ate like someone who'd been told food was temporary. Hazel ate steadily and without comment, which he appreciated more than enthusiasm. He ate standing at the far end of the table, which was habit, because standing meant he was ready to move, and being ready to move was how he'd organized his whole life. "You don't have to stand," Nora said. "I know." "There's 2 chairs." "I know." "You can have mine. I can sit on the floor." She was already preparing to demonstrate this. "Sit in the chair," he said. "But then you have to stand." "I like standing." Nora gave this the skeptical silence it deserved and then went back to her oats. By mid-morning, the clay had thawed enough to work, and Hazel went after the north wall gap with a focus that he found genuinely startling. She didn't ask for instruction. She didn't ask for tools, just looked at what was available and took what she needed. She worked the clay into the gap with her fingers and the handle of a wooden spoon, pressing and smoothing with a confidence that said this was not her first chinking job. And she did it while carrying on a running conversation with Nora about something entirely unrelated to the wall. Some ongoing disagreement about whether a horse could theoretically climb a ladder, and the whole thing was so bizarrely domestic that Silas had to go outside for 10 minutes just to remember what his life had felt like the day before yesterday. It had felt quieter. That was accurate. Whether it had felt better was a question he didn't want to examine too directly. He spent the morning checking his stores and food, firewood, the state of his traps, which he couldn't get to in this weather and would need to check the moment it broke, the condition of his tools, the rope supply. He did this with one ear always on the cabin, which was a new behavior that irritated him. But Nora had taken it upon herself to conduct a detailed inspection of everything in the cabin and ask a question about each item, and Hazel was letting her, which meant Silas kept hearing his own possessions being interrogated by a 7-year-old. "What's this?" "Hide scraper." "What's this one?" "Different hide scraper." "Why do you need 2? He'd come back inside by then. He looked at the 2 scrapers in Nora's hands. "One's for elk, one's for beaver." She held them both up and examined them with scientific interest. They look the same. They're not. How are they different? He explained the difference. He hadn't talked this much before noon in years, possibly ever. He was not sure if he minded. What broke the relative equilibrium of the morning was the firewood count. He'd known it was going to be a problem. He'd done the math at 3 in the morning and done it again at 5, and the math was the math. He had enough wood for himself through the worst of winter with a reasonable margin. He did not have enough for 3 people and a second horse through an extended storm of unknown duration, not if they burned at a rate sufficient to keep Nora warm, which was non-negotiable. He told Hazel at midday, with the straightforward delivery of a man who'd had no one to soften news for so long that he'd forgotten how. "We've got a wood problem," he said. She looked up from where she was doing something with a needle and thread to what appeared to be his second-best coat, which had a tear in the left elbow that he'd been ignoring for 2 months. He hadn't asked her to mend it. She'd apparently found it, assessed it, and decided to address it on her own authority. "How short?" she asked. He told her. She set down the coat. "There's deadfall on the east slope, about a quarter-mile below the tree line. I saw it on the way up. Big spruce, been down a while, dry enough. If we could get to it." "Not in this weather." "How long before there's a break?" "Hard to say. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning. Then we burn low until the break and go at the deadfall the minute the wind drops." "That's my plan," he said. "Okay." She picked the coat back up. "Then that's the plan." He watched her thread the needle with the focused irritability of a person who needs reading glasses and is not ready to admit it, and he looked at his coat, which she was fixing without having been asked, and he said, "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. "Seriously." "I know that too." He stood there for another moment and then sat down at the table, which was the first time he'd sat at his own table with another adult in 8 years, and the chair felt strange under him, like a thing he'd been using wrong. Nora appeared at his elbow. "Do you want to play a game?" "No." "Do you know any games?" "No." "I can teach you one." "Nora," Hazel said, with the same not quite warning tone as before. "He said no games. He didn't say he didn't want company," Nora said, with the specific legal precision of a child who has spent considerable time identifying the exact edges of parental rules. Silas looked at her, 7 years old and already parsing language like a lawyer. He didn't know whether to be alarmed or impressed. "I have work to do," he said. "What kind of work?" "I need to repair a snare." Nora's eyes went wide, not with fear, with the particular excitement of someone who has just discovered that the world contains more interesting things than previously known. "Can I watch?" He opened his mouth. "Nora," Hazel said. "He can say no." "Then let him say it." Silas looked between the two of them. The mother and the daughter, both watching him, both with the same dark eyes and the same quality of direct attention that didn't demand anything from him except honesty. "Fine," he said. "You can watch. You don't touch anything. You don't ask more than one question every 5 minutes." Nora sat down across from him with her hands folded on the table. "I'm ready." "I haven't started yet." "I know. I'm ready for when you do." He got the snare wire and the pliers and started working, and Nora watched with her chin on her folded hands and her eyes tracking every movement with the intense focus of a child who is genuinely trying to understand rather than just being entertained. She lasted 4 minutes before she asked the first question, which was about how he knew what size loop to make, and it was actually not a bad question. He answered it. He answered the second question, which came right on time at 5 minutes, and the third, and somewhere around the 6th question he realized he'd been talking steadily for half an hour, and had fixed not only the broken snare, but 2 other snares he'd been putting off for a week, and the work had gone faster than it ever did when he was alone. He didn't acknowledge this out loud because there was no universe in which that conversation ended anywhere good. The storm broke in the early hours of the second day. Not fully, but enough. The howl dropped to a sustained complaint, and the snow thinned from wall-to-wall white to something intermittent and manageable. Silas was up at first gray light, and Hazel was up 10 minutes later, and they looked at each other across the quiet cabin and had a conversation entirely without words. He got the axes. She got her coat. They left Nora sleeping by the banked fire with strict instructions, which Hazel delivered in a voice that brooked absolutely no argument, not to go outside under any circumstances. Nora said she understood. She probably understood. The walk to the deadfall was harder than he'd made it sound. The snow was thigh-high in the gullies, and the cold had a teeth to it that came up through the boots and worked its way toward the knees, and the east slope was steep enough that you needed to watch every step or lose your footing. He watched Hazel navigate it. He watched her plant her feet and use her weight deliberately, shifting her hips like someone who knew how gravity worked and had decided to use it rather than fight it. She didn't slip. She didn't fall behind. When they hit the steepest section, she went up it with her axe in one hand and her free hand out to her side for balance, not reaching for anything, just ready if she needed it. He didn't offer to help. She wouldn't have wanted him to. That was already clear. The deadfall was where she'd spotted it, a big spruce, 3 feet across, down in a natural hollow that had protected it from the worst rot. He hit it with the axe to test it, and it rang solid. Good wood, dry enough. They worked without talking. That was fine. He'd thought it would feel strange, working alongside someone, but it didn't. It felt oddly efficient, like 2 gears that happened to fit. She had a strong swing and good aim, and she didn't try to chop the way he chopped, which would have been wrong for her build. She found her own rhythm, shorter strokes, more consistent, and the wood came apart in front of her at a rate that was frankly respectable. After about 40 minutes, he said, "Where'd you learn to swing an axe?" She didn't stop swinging. "Same place I learned to do most things. Needed to, so I did." "That's not really an answer." She stopped. She looked at him, breathing hard, her face red with cold and effort. "My husband was a blacksmith. I worked the forge with him from the first year we were married. He taught me what he knew about metal. The axe and the splitting maul I figured out myself because he was sick a lot the last 2 years and the wood wasn't going to cut itself." He nodded. "Nora was 5 when he got sick," Hazel said. "She still carried kindling, small bundles, but she carried them." He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say to that wasn't either insufficient or intrusive. "She's not fragile," Hazel said, and this part sounded like something she said to people who needed saying it to, which probably meant a lot of people had assumed otherwise. "She's the least fragile person I know." "I noticed," he said. Something shifted in Hazel's expression, not quite a smile, something earlier than a smile. They loaded the cut wood onto the drag sled he'd brought and started back up the slope, and the work of pulling the sled meant no more talking, which was honestly a relief because the conversation had wandered into territory that felt unexpectedly close to something. By the time they got back to the cabin, Nora was awake and had swept the floor. He stood in the doorway and looked at his swept floor. He'd had a dirt floor issue. Not technically a dirt floor, but the planks were uneven and caught debris, and he swept when he remembered, which wasn't often. The floor was clean. Nora was standing next to the broom with an expression of immense self-satisfaction. "I found the broom," she said. "I see that. The floor had a lot of things on it. It usually does. Not anymore." He looked at Hazel. Hazel looked at the ceiling briefly. "Thank you," he said to Nora, because it seemed like the accurate thing to say. Nora beamed like he'd handed her something. It was a startling quantity of light from a small person. He looked away first. The afternoon of the second day was when the conversation went somewhere neither of them had planned. It started with the wagon axle. Hazel had been thinking about it. He could tell by the way she went quiet in a different way than her usual quiet, the kind of quiet that meant a problem running in the background. She'd been sketching in the margin of one of his old record books with a stub of pencil she'd produced from somewhere, and when he looked over her shoulder without really meaning to, he saw that she'd drawn a diagram. Not a rough sketch, a precise dimensioned diagram of the broken axle and what she needed to repair it. "You're a draftsman," he said, before he could stop himself. "I'm a person who needs to fix a broken axle and can't afford to get it wrong." He looked at the diagram more carefully. She'd measured the break by memory and estimated the dimensions with a precision that spoke to a lot of time working in 3 dimensions from 2-dimensional plans. "You'd need a forge," he said. "I know. There's no forge up here." "I know that too. Declan Marsh at the trading outpost has a small one. mostly for shoe repairs and tool mending. She went very still. How far? 7 miles down the mountain, trails usually passable a day after a storm this size. She looked at her diagram. If I could get to that forge, if Marsh would let me use it, I could fabricate a sleeve that would hold the axle long enough to get to the next settlement. It wouldn't be pretty, but it would hold. Have you done that kind of repair before? On smaller axles. The principle's the same. She paused. Is Marsh a reasonable man? Silas thought about Declan Marsh, who was 63 years old and had been running the outpost alone since his partner died of a snake bite in the summer, and who regarded most of humanity with the deep personal suspicion it had earned. He's a fair man, he said carefully. He doesn't take to strangers easily. I'm not asking him to take to me. I'm asking to use his forge. I'll pay in labor or trade. He might say no. I'll ask him anyway. He looked at her. You're not worried he'll say no? I'm always worried, she said simply. I just do the thing anyway. There was a silence in which the fire crackled, and Nora could be heard in the corner having a detailed conversation with a piece of knotted rope she'd apparently decided was a horse. My wife, Silas started and then stopped. Hazel didn't push. She waited. This was the thing about her that he kept running up against. She waited. Not with performance, not with the manufactured patience of someone wanting credit for their restraint. She just waited. Like she had time and she'd decided he could have some of it. I was going to say, he said carefully, I had a woman before all this, before the fire. He wasn't sure why he was saying it. He hadn't said it to anyone in 8 years, not even to Declan. She left after my face. I can't blame her for it. She hadn't signed up for... He made a gesture that meant himself. But it was the particular way she did it. She didn't say she couldn't love me anymore. She said she couldn't be seen with me. That was the word she used, seen. Hazel was quiet for a moment. That's a vicious thing to say to a person, she said at last. She probably didn't mean it vicious. That doesn't make it less vicious. He didn't argue because she wasn't wrong. I got stared at in every town between here and the last place I lived, Hazel said. She said it matter of fact. No performance in it. Not for my face, for my size. People stare at fat women like we owe them an explanation. Like being big in public is something we need to apologize for. She looked at the fire. After Thomas died, I had people in town tell me that the journey west was too hard for someone like me, that I should stay put and find a way to make do, that I was too much of a risk to myself and my daughter. She said it the same way she'd described the broken axle. Here's the thing that is true. Here's the problem. Here's what I'm going to do about it anyway. Nobody who looked at me from the outside could see what I was capable of. They just saw the outside. Silas thought about that for a long moment. I don't look at you that way, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. The fire cracked. Nora's rope horse had apparently developed a personality and a conflict with an imaginary other rope horse, and she was narrating the dispute with considerable dramatic investment. He was not a man who cried, hadn't been for years, had decided at some point that it cost more than it returned, but something behind his sternum shifted in a way that was uncomfortable and real, and he sat with it because there was nowhere to put it. I look at people from the outside too, he said. I didn't used to. I do now. What do you see when you look at me? He considered that. He wasn't a man who answered questions carelessly. Someone who decides what a thing is worth before she spends herself on it. Someone who doesn't waste motion. He paused. Someone who has been underestimated so many times she stopped being surprised by it and just uses it. Hazel looked at him. That's probably the most words you've said at once, she said. Probably. Was any of it wrong? No. Okay, she said, and turned back to her diagram. And that was somehow the most complete conversation he'd had with another human being since before the fire, and it had ended the way the best conversations do, with neither person needing to say anything more. The third day brought a problem with the roof. He heard it in the night, a groan that was different from the usual settling, the particular overtone of weight in the wrong place. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, standing in the dark cabin with every sense trained upward. He stood there long enough that Hazel stirred on the cot. "What is it?" she said, instantly awake, which told him everything about how she slept. "Snow load on the north section of the roof. Something shifted." She sat up. "How bad?" He listened. The groan came again, lower, more sustained. "Bad enough. We need to clear it. I need to clear it. You—" "Don't," she said, and her voice was not raised, but it had the particular quality of a closed door. "Don't do that." He wanted to argue. The roof was icy and the pitch was not gentle, and the snow up there was probably 300 pounds of dense pack in the worst section. But she was already standing, already reaching for her coat, and there was the matter of his roof, which was currently doing its structural best against odds it wasn't designed for. "I take the near section," he said. "You take the middle. You don't go near the north edge." Agreed. They went out into the cold dark, and Nora slept on. The roof was worse than he'd hoped. The snow had come off the spruce, overhanging the north corner, and piled on top of existing drift until the load was uneven and heavy at the seam between two roof sections. He could feel the structure flexing when he put his weight on the lower section, not catastrophically, not yet, but with the clear intention of getting there. They worked fast. He had the long-handled snow rake, and she found the spare shovel where he'd described it in the lean-to, and they moved the load in sections from the top down, working at an angle across the roof that distributed their weight, pausing when the structure spoke under them, working around each other with the unconscious coordination of two people who were both very good at reading a physical situation. 40 minutes in, they had the worst of it clear. He could hear the roof settle into a more confident posture, the groan dropping to a creak, and then to silence. He straightened up, and his back registered its opinion of the last hour, and he ignored it. He looked across the cleared section at Hazel. She was looking at the remaining snow on the near edge, the section he'd told her not to go to. "Leave it," he said. "There's still too much weight on that." "Hazel," she looked at him. "Leave it. It'll shed on its own when the temperature comes up tomorrow. We've done what needed doing." She looked at the snow. She looked at it with the expression of someone who does not leave problems half-finished and has to consciously choose to. "Okay," she said. They climbed down. He went first and she followed, and when she reached the last rung of the ladder and stepped down onto the snow-packed ground, she exhaled a breath she'd apparently been holding for a while. "Good roof," she said. "Terrible roof," he said, "but it'll last." "That's basically the same thing in a storm." He didn't disagree. They went back inside. Nora had not woken up. The fire had burned down and he built it back, and the cabin filled up with warmth again. And the three of them, Silas at the table, Hazel on the cot, Nora on the floor with her quilt pulled to her ears, existed in the specific quiet that follows surviving something together. He didn't sleep for the rest of that night either, but it was different now. Before, the wakefulness had been the hollow kind. A man lying in the dark listening to the sound of his own breathing because there was nothing else. Now there were two other people breathing. There was the creak of Nora turning in her sleep. There was the specific quality of Hazel's stillness, the kind that meant she wasn't sleeping yet either, though they didn't speak. At some point he became aware that the quality of silence from the cot had changed, smoothed out, deepened, and Hazel was finally asleep. He sat with that for a while. He thought about what she'd said, about being seen, about Thomas the blacksmith who'd taught her forge work and died and left her with a mule's stubbornness and a daughter's worth of responsibility, about the people who'd told her the journey was too much for a woman like her. He thought about his own scar and the way most people couldn't look at it directly, and the way Hazel had been looking directly at his face since the first minute on the trail without adjusting her expression or performing comfort. He thought that he had lived on this mountain for 8 years and had become very good at surviving and absolutely terrible at living. And then Nora made a small sound in her sleep, not distress, just the ordinary unconscious noise of a child dreaming. And something about it was so alive, so entirely and unselfconsciously present in the world, that he felt it like a hand pressed flat against his sternum. He had forgotten what it felt like to be in the same room as people who were not afraid of him. He was beginning to remember, and it was not a comfortable process. It felt like a frostbitten hand coming back to warmth. That particular mix of pain and relief that means something is still alive that you'd stop believing in. He was not sure what to do with that, and so he did what he always did. He sat with it in the dark and waited, and let the mountain hold the silence around the cabin, the way it always had. Except now the silence had people in it, and they were starting, very quietly and without permission, to feel like his. The fourth morning arrived without drama, which was its own kind of warning. Silas had lived on the mountain long enough to distrust quiet weather the way a careful man distrusts a quiet adversary. The storm had pulled back in the night, not gone, pulled back, the way something breathes in before it really lets loose. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air had a stillness to it that pressed against the eardrums. He stood in the cabin doorway at first light and looked at it and felt the particular cold that comes before a second wave. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself with wind but just settles in like it owns the place. He went back inside. Hazel was already awake, sitting at the table with her diagram of the axle repair and her stub of pencil, but she wasn't drawing. She was looking at what she'd already drawn, which meant she'd solved the problem she was working on and was now just verifying the solution. He recognized that mode of thinking because he did it himself with trap lines. The walking through it again that isn't doubt but confirmation. "Second wave coming," he said. She looked up. "When?" "Tonight. Maybe sooner." She looked at the window. "Worse than the first?" "Can't say. The first was bad. This one has the same smell." She set the pencil down. "The roof section we didn't clear." "Yeah." That was the whole conversation. 2 sentences about the problem, no argument about what it meant, no asking him to explain what he already knew. He appreciated that economy more than he could have articulated. Nora woke up 15 minutes later with a specific complaint about the oats, which had been on the menu for 4 days running, and whose appeal, she explained with considerable diplomatic care, had diminished significantly. He looked at her, and then at his stores, and then went and found a small cache of cornmeal he'd been rationing and made cornbread in the iron skillet, which was not something he'd done for anyone in years, and which he executed with the focused concentration of a man who has done a thing long enough to do it well but has never had an audience for it. Nora watched the whole process with the absorbed attention she gave to everything, and then, when he put the skillet on the table, she said, "You're a good cook." "I'm a functional cook," he said. "That's the same thing when you're hungry," she said, which was her mother's logic in a smaller voice. Hazel almost smiled. He caught the edge of it before she turned to cut the bread into sections. The morning held. He worked on his winter records, the tallies of hides and pelts and supplies that Declan would need when trading season came. And Hazel spent 2 hours going back over the north wall chinking, adding a second layer to the section she'd done on the first day, pressing it into the cracks with her thumb in a methodical way that said she wasn't satisfied with the first pass, even though the first pass had already made a measurable difference in the cabin temperature. Nora wrote letters in the dirt by the hearth with a twig, then drew a map of what she imagined the mountain looked like from above, then interrogated Silas about what animals lived in the upper spruce line with a thoroughness that suggested she was either going to be a naturalist or a lawyer, and the distinction wasn't yet clear. He answered her questions. He found, to his ongoing confusion, that he did not resent answering them. "Do wolves come up this high?" she asked. "Sometimes. More in hard winters." "Have you ever seen one?" "Plenty." "Were you scared?" He thought about the honest answer. "First few times, then you learn what they're actually thinking about, which is mostly not you." "What are they thinking about?" "Elk, mostly." "Same thing I'm thinking about." Nora absorbed this. "So you and the wolves think about the same stuff?" "More or less." "That's kind of nice," she said with complete sincerity. He didn't know what to do with that, so he went back to his records. But he filed it somewhere, the way he'd started filing things, she said. Not intentionally, they just stayed. By early afternoon, the sky had darkened 2 shades, and the wind had started the particular low moan that came before it found its register. He'd been watching it out of the corner of his eye all morning, that sky, and when it started doing what he knew it was going to do, he put down his records and stood up. "It's moving faster than I thought," he said. Hazel came to the window. She stood next to him, and they both looked at the same sky and saw the same thing. And then she said, "How long do we have?" 2 hours, maybe less. We need more wood inside. I'll get it. I'll help. One of us should stay with... Nora can stay inside. She knows the rules. Hazel turned to her daughter. Nora. Nora looked up from her map. You stay inside. You don't open the door. You keep the fire going. Wow. Small pieces, not the big logs. You know how? I know how, Nora said, with the calm competence of a child who has been given real responsibilities for long enough that she doesn't feel the need to perform reliability. Be careful. That last part was said to both of them equally, which hit Silas somewhere unexpected. He turned for his coat before his face could do anything he'd have to explain. They made 3 trips to the woodpile in deteriorating conditions, the wind climbing in pitch with each trip until by the 3rd one it was actively unpleasant. Not dangerous yet, but leaning toward it, snow beginning to move sideways rather than down. They stacked wood inside the door and against the south wall and in the corner by the stove, and it was not as much as he'd wanted, but it would have to do. On the 3rd trip back, he stopped and looked at the north corner of the roof, the section they hadn't cleared. He'd looked at it this morning and made the calculation that the temperature would rise enough during the day to shed some of the load naturally. The temperature had not risen. The load was still up there, and now more was coming. Hazel had stopped beside him. She was looking at the same section. If we get another foot of accumulation on top of what's already there, she started. The seam will fail, he said. I know. We need to clear it now. He looked at the sky. The wind was gusting hard enough to make standing on a sloped surface actively hazardous. It's not safe to go up there. It's not safe to let that seam fail either. He knew she was right. He'd been making calculations since this morning, and they kept coming out the same. The structural risk of leaving it was worse than the physical risk of clearing it, and he hated that math with everything he had. I'll go, he said. You stay down and keep tension on the safety line. You're heavier than me. If you slip on that pitch in this wind, I know the roof. I know how to clear a surface. I've been on steeper. She said it matter of fact, not boasting. Thomas's barn had a steeper pitch than this. I cleared it twice in winters worse than this one. He wanted to argue. He had about 12 ways to argue prepared, and every one of them came down to the same thing. He didn't want her up there, and the reason he didn't want her up there was not purely structural logic, and acknowledging that would take the conversation somewhere neither of them was ready for. Fine, he said. You take the near section. I take the far edge. We work together. We don't rush. We stop if the wind gusts over a certain point. Agreed. They went up. The roof was worse than it had been in the middle of the night. The snow had crusted in layers, new on top of old, the bottom layer partially frozen to the shingles, which meant it was heavier than it looked, and came off in unpredictable slabs rather than clean sweeps. He worked methodically, reading the surface before each push of the rake, letting the tool do the work rather than forcing it, keeping his weight low and centered. He could hear Hazel working 20 feet away, the steady scrape of the shovel blade, and he found himself tracking the sound the same way he tracked the wind. They'd been working about 20 minutes when the first bad gust came. It didn't come gradually. It hit like something thrown, a wall of wind from the northwest that caught the loose snow and turned it into horizontal white and stole about 3 feet of visibility in under a second. He dropped the rake and got both hands on the ridgeboard and held, and felt the roof shudder under him with the weight of the gust, and waited. It passed. Maybe 4 seconds. Long enough. You good? He called. Good, she called back. They kept working. He moved to the seam section, the critical zone, and started clearing the deep pack that had accumulated there. It was dense, the kind of snow that compresses under its own weight, and it came off in heavy loads that he had to be careful not to shed all at once or he'd overbalance. He heard the second gust before he felt it, a different sound, lower, sustained, the kind that doesn't peak and pass but rolls through like something with intention. He started to call out to Hazel. He heard her shout, not words, just the involuntary sound of surprise, and then the scrape of the shovel, and then nothing. He turned. She wasn't on the roof. The place where she'd been was just snow and the dropped shovel, and then he looked down and she was on the ground, on her side, 10 feet below the eave line, and she wasn't moving. He went off the roof faster than he should have. Not a controlled descent, barely controlled, landing in the deep snow at the base, and going to his knees and being up again before his body had fully processed any of it. He crossed to her in 4 strides. She was conscious. Her eyes were open and tracking when he reached her, but she hadn't moved yet, and her face had the gray-white quality of a person whose body is busy figuring out what just happened before it forwards the pain report. "Don't move," he said. "I know," she said. Tight voice, controlled. "Where does it hurt?" "Everywhere." A breath. "Left side mostly, hip, maybe the ribs." He looked at her position. She'd come off the roof and hit the sloped snowpack below the eave, and slid rather than dropped straight down, which had distributed the impact. That was something. The snow had been deep enough to absorb some of it, also something. He'd seen men fall off lower roofs and break both legs. "Can you breathe?" he asked. She demonstrated by taking a slow, deliberate breath that made her close her eyes briefly with the effort of keeping her face neutral. "Breathing," she confirmed. "I'm going to move you." "I know. It's going to hurt." "I know that too." She opened her eyes. They were steady. Focused. The only thing not steady was her hands, which were pressed flat against the snow on either side of her and shaking with a fine tremor she was clearly trying not to let happen. "Do it." He lifted her. He was a big man. Years of trapping and chopping and hauling on a mountain had made him functionally enormous in the way that people who work with their bodies actually are, rather than the way they look. He lifted her with his arms under her back and her knees, and he carried her to the cabin door and pushed through it. Nora looked up from the fire. The look on her face lasted only a second, the sharp, total fear of a child seeing a parent hurt. And then she got up and came across the room and held the door and didn't ask any questions, which was the most impressive thing Silas had seen in recent memory. He laid Hazel on the cot. "Nora," Hazel said immediately, and her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "I'm okay." "You're not okay," Nora said. "I'm going to be okay." "That's different." "Yes," Hazel said. "That's different. But I will be." Nora stood at the edge of the cot and looked at her mother for a long moment with those large dark eyes, doing her own assessment, and then she turned to Silas with a specific expression on her face. Not panic, not helplessness, but the focused directness she'd inherited from Hazel in full measure. "What does she need?" Nora asked. He'd already been thinking through it. "Hot water, cloth. The small bag at the bottom of my kit on the south shelf. It's got a rib wrap and some drawing salve." Nora went without a word. He turned back to Hazel and started carefully working off her coat. She helped where she could, which wasn't much. The left side of her coat was packed with snow, and when he got it off, he could see the problem with the hip immediately. The fabric of her trousers was already showing bruised dark at the outer thigh, and when he ran his hands along the hip bone, she made a sound that was very quiet and very specific. "Not broken," he said. "Probably." "Comforting," she said. "I'm not in the business of comfortable. The bone would feel different. This is deep bruise, maybe a small crack. Same treatment either way." "The ribs?" He pressed along the left side carefully, watching her face. She gave him the information he needed through the exact timing of her reactions, which was precise enough that he trusted it. 2 or 3 on the left, maybe 4, could be cracked, could be bruised. The breathing will tell us over the next few hours. If they're cracked. "It'll hurt more to breathe and cough and laugh," he said, "which means don't laugh." "That should be easy," she said dryly, which made him understand she would be laughing purely out of stubbornness inside the hour. Nora came back with the water and the kit bag, and then stationed herself at the foot of the cot in a way that was not going to be argued with. She'd also, he noticed, put more wood on the fire without being asked, the right size logs in the right configuration. He worked in silence, wrapping the ribs with the same care he used for everything mechanical. Not fast, not careless, with the attention that comes from knowing the difference between doing a thing and doing it right. He talked Hazel through each step before he did it, not because she needed managing, but because her body would cooperate better if it knew what was coming. She kept her eyes on the ceiling and breathed when he told her to breathe, and held when he told her to hold. The roof, she said when he was finishing the wrap. Don't. Silas, the roof. He tied off the wrap. I'll go back up when you're settled. The seam. I know about the seam. I'm not going to let the roof fall in. I just need you to stay still for 10 minutes first. She looked at him. She was pale and sweat damp, and there was something around her eyes that was the place where pain collects, when you're refusing to let it show on the rest of your face. She was still the most focused person he'd been in a room with in 8 years. 10 minutes, she said. 10 minutes. He went back out into the storm. The wind had found its full voice now. The kind that you have to lean into, and the kind that makes the trees talk to each other in high, thin voices. He went up the ladder with his weight checked at each rung and got to the critical seam and worked in the worst conditions he'd been on a roof in since the 3rd winter, when an ice storm had taken a section of eave clean off, and he'd spent 6 hours in the dark doing emergency repairs that held less well than they should have and more than he'd expected. He cleared the seam. He did it right. Not fast, not rough, carefully and completely, shedding the load in controlled amounts, checking the structural seam underneath after each pass to feel whether the roofing boards were still seated. They were. They held. By the time he came down, the wind had pushed the temperature down another 5 degrees and his hands were beyond cold, into the territory where they worked on will and habit rather than sensation. He came inside. Hazel was not on the cot. She was at the fireplace, on her knees, feeding a piece of wood into the fire, moving with the particular careful economy of a person managing significant pain and making the absolute minimum number of complaints about it. I told you 10 minutes, he said. It's been 12, she said. Fire needed attention. He stood in the doorway with his frozen hands and looked at her. He didn't say the thing he was thinking, which was complicated and came from somewhere he didn't have a name for yet. He said instead, Nora could have done that. Nora's asleep, Hazel said, glancing toward the corner where Nora had apparently curled up with her quilt and finally surrendered to the afternoon. She's been holding herself together since I fell. Let her sleep. He came in and shut the door. He held his hands toward the fire and didn't look at Hazel directly, which was its own kind of cowardice, and he knew it. The roof? She asked. It'll hold, he said. I got the seam cleared. Good. She sat back on her heels and then made the careful transition to sitting rather than kneeling, which clearly cost her. She didn't make a sound doing it. You should be on the cot, he said. I'll get back on the cot in a minute. She wasn't looking at the fire anymore. She was looking at him. Are you all right? He blinked. I'm fine. Your hands. He looked at his hands, which had progressed from not feeling to feeling extremely bad, the way warm feels when you've gone past the safe side of cold. I've had worse, he said. That's not what I asked. He sat down on the floor near the fire, not the chair, the floor, old habit, and held his hands palm up toward the heat and let the warmth start the bad process of bringing sensation back. Hazel reached over and took his hands in hers. He went completely still. She wrapped her hands around his. Her hands were warm from the fire, work-roughed, wider in the palm than you'd expect, and held them in the steady, practical way you hold a thing that needs warming. Not gentle, not tender exactly, just present, direct, the same way she did everything. He didn't pull away. He should have, by his own logic, by every rule he'd made for himself about distance and what was smart and what it cost to want something from a person who was going to leave. But his hands were cold and her hands were warm, and he was very tired, in a way that went deeper than the cold and the roof and the storm. They sat like that in front of the fire for a minute, maybe 2. Silas, she said. Don't, he said. A pause. Don't what? Don't say something that makes this harder than it already is. She was quiet for a moment. I was going to say your fingers are getting their color back. He looked down. They were. Okay, he said. She let go of his hands, and they both looked at the fire instead of each other for a while, and outside the storm reached its full, furious register and threw itself against the cabin with everything it had, and the cabin held, the way things built for the long-term hold. Imperfectly, loudly, but they hold. The night was the worst of all of them. Not for the storm, which peaked around midnight and then began, very slowly, to give ground, but for Hazel. The fever came on fast, the way injury fevers do when a body has been in the cold too long after taking damage. He'd seen it before. The inflammatory response, the temperature spiking as the body threw everything it had at the problem. By midnight, she was shaking on the cot despite every blanket he owned, and by 1 in the morning she was speaking in the fragmented, disconnected way of someone whose body had temporarily commandeered the speaking parts for other business. She said Thomas's name twice. She said something about a forge that he couldn't follow. She said once, with complete clarity and enormous anger, "I told you I could fix it," to someone who wasn't in the room. He didn't know if she meant the axle or something else. He sat beside the cot, and he did not sleep. Nora woke at 2 and came and sat on his other side without asking, pulling her quilt around herself, and they both sat there in the dark and kept watch the way you keep watch over the things you can't afford to lose. "Is she going to be okay?" Nora asked. The diplomat's caution was gone from her voice. She was just a 7-year-old asking the question that was keeping her up. He thought about the honest answer. He thought about what Hazel would want him to say to her daughter in this moment. "Yes," he said. And then, because Nora was not a child, you could shortchange on accuracy. "The fever's going to get worse before it gets better. That's how fevers work. But your mother is strong in a way that goes deeper than the outside, and her body knows it even when the rest of her is occupied." Nora considered this. "You mean she's stubborn?" "I mean her body is stubborn," he said, "which is the kind of stubborn that actually helps." Nora leaned sideways and rested her head against his arm, which he was not prepared for, and he sat very still for a moment, the way you sit still when something fragile has settled near you and you don't want to disturb it. "I'm glad we found your cabin," she said. He didn't answer right away. "Me too," he said at last, and meant it in more directions than he could count. He kept Hazel cool when the fever climbed, cold cloth to her forehead and throat, the back of the neck, the wrists, and kept her warm when the chills shook her, which was a contradictory set of instructions that a fever makes necessary. And he did it through the night with the same sustained attention he gave to anything he'd decided mattered. He gave her water in small sips when she was conscious enough to swallow. He talked to her, low and without expectation of response. Not comfort talk, just information, the real kind, the things you say when you don't know if someone can hear you, but you need them to know anyway. He said, "The roof held." He said, "Patience is fine. The bay's fine. Nora's asleep." He said, around 3 in the morning, when the fever was at its worst, and Hazel's face was flushed dark, and her breathing was fast and shallow, and he was doing the math on what he could actually do versus what the situation required. "You don't get to quit on me. You said you weren't going to be a complaining guest. Quitting would be a complaint." She made a sound. It was not a word, but it had a quality that might have been argument. "That's right," he said. "Keep arguing." By 4 in the morning, the fever broke. It broke the way fevers do. Not dramatically, just the sweat coming, and the breathing slowing, and the face losing that alarming flush. He felt her forehead, and the heat had dropped to something manageable and kept dropping. He sat back and let out a breath he'd been holding in part since midnight. Nora had fallen asleep again around 3, curled at the foot of the cot with her quilt pulled over her head, and he looked at her and then at Hazel and at the fire which needed building up, and at the window where the first gray suggestion of dawn was fighting its way through the tail end of the storm. He built the fire. He put water on for the almost coffee. He sat down at the table and put his face in his hands for a moment, just long enough to be somewhere private inside the exhaustion, and then he took his hands away and sat straight again. An hour later, Hazel opened her eyes. They were clearer than they'd been all night. She looked at the ceiling, then at the window, then at Nora asleep at her feet, and then at Silas at the table. "You didn't sleep," she said. Her voice was wrecked from the fever, low and rough. "I slept," he said. She looked at him. "A little," he said. "Silas, you had a fever." She closed her eyes, opened them again. "Bad?" "Bad enough that you told someone off at 3 in the morning, someone who wasn't in the room. A very faint sound that might have been almost a laugh." "That sounds like me." "It did." She tried to push herself up and stopped immediately. "Ribs," he said. "I remember the ribs," she said, with feeling. "Don't try to sit up yet. Give it another few hours." She lay back and stared at the ceiling. "How's the roof?" "The roof is fine." "And the storm?" "Breaking. Should be done by noon." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her processing, the methodical inventory of someone cataloging where they are and what comes next. He recognized it. He did the same thing every morning, had done it for 8 years. It just usually only took him 30 seconds because the list never changed. "You stayed up all night," she said. Not a question this time. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her. She was looking back at him from the cot, pale, fever-washed, with her hair loose around her face and her voice rough and her ribs making every breath a small negotiation. And she still had those eyes that didn't ask for anything except honesty. "Because you needed someone to," he said. She held his gaze. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, not quite anything he had a word for. Something that was its own thing. "Thank you," she said. Not the polite version, the real one. He nodded. Nora stirred at the foot of the cot and surfaced from her quilt blinking. She looked at her mother. Her mother looked back. "Fever's gone," Hazel said before Nora could ask. Nora breathed. It was the specific exhale of a child who has been holding their breath for hours, maybe longer. "Okay," Nora said, then, "I'm hungry." He got up and made oats. There was nothing triumphant about the morning that followed. His back was stiff from the hours on the hard chair. His hands ached from the combination of cold and warm. The storm wasn't gone yet. Still complaining outside, just quieter. Hazel couldn't sit up without help, and she accepted help with a controlled expression that made it clear she was working very hard on not finding it humiliating, which he respected because he would have felt exactly the same. Nora ate her oats and asked whether wolves came out after storms, which led to a 20-minute conversation that kept all three of them from thinking too directly about what the night had cost. In the afternoon, when the storm had dropped to intermittent flurries and the cabin had reached a temperature that could be called something other than an emergency, Hazel slept. Really slept. The deep, boneless sleep of a body that has finished fighting and needs to account for the expenditure. He and Nora sat at the table and he showed her how to read a trapline map, explaining the symbols he used, and she was intent and careful and asked questions with the specific patience of a child who understands that some knowledge is serious and deserves serious attention. At some point she said, without looking up from the map, "Mama's going to be okay." "She is," he said. "Because she's stubborn." "Because she's strong," he said. "The stubborn is part of the strength." Nora traced one of the trapline paths with her small finger. "You're strong too," she said. "Different strong, but strong." He looked at the top of her head. "You stayed up all night," she said. "I heard you talking to her." He hadn't known she'd been awake. He should have known. She was her mother's daughter, and her mother didn't miss anything. "I didn't want her to be alone," he said. Nora looked up at him then, and her face held something that was too large and too composed for 7 years old, the face of a child who has learned that the world contains real loss and still managed to stay open to it. "You're not very alone anymore," she said. He opened his mouth and closed it again. She went back to the map. He sat with what she'd said the way he sat with the mountain at night, holding it, not trying to change it, just letting it be what it was. Outside, the storm finally found its last breath and spent it, and the silence that came after was a different kind than the silence before. Not the empty kind, not the hollow kind he'd lived in for 8 years. Full this time. The way silence is when the thing you've been waiting for, without knowing you were waiting, has finally arrived. Spring did not arrive the way it does in paintings. It came in pieces, reluctant and uneven, the way things change when they've been one way for a long time and the shift costs something. A week of warmth followed by 3 days of hard freeze. Mud that froze overnight and thawed by noon and turned the trail down the mountain into something between a path and a creek. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving dark patches of exposed ground that steamed in the morning light like something alive deciding to wake up. Silas noticed all of it. He'd been noticing spring arrive for 8 years on this mountain, and it had always been a practical event. The season changing meant the trapline changed, the trade run to Declan became possible. The summer work began. This year he noticed it the way a man notices a door opening that he isn't sure he wants to walk through. The trip to Declan Marsh's outpost happened on the first day the trail was genuinely passable, 2 weeks after the storm. Hazel's ribs had gone from sharp pain to deep ache to the sullen background complaint that meant they were knitting, which is an ugly process that doesn't feel like progress, but is. Her hip had bruised spectacularly for 10 days, a color progression that Nora documented with the scientific interest of someone studying weather patterns, and then faded to something she could walk on without the particular controlled expression. She'd wanted to go to the outpost on day 8. He'd said no. She'd said she didn't remember asking. He'd said that her ribs were still making a sound when she breathed that he didn't like, and that if she wanted to work a forge, she needed ribs that could handle the posture and the exertion, and that if she went too early and set herself back further, they'd lose more time than they'd save. She'd looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Fine, day 12, day 14, 13, 14. She'd made a sound that was not agreement and not argument, which he'd come to recognize as her version of accepting a compromise she'd arrived at before she started the conversation. Day 14 was when they went. He went with them, which was not something he'd planned out loud, but which happened anyway. The morning of the trip, he saddled Patience and loaded what he needed for a trade run as if this were any other season. And when Hazel came out of the cabin with Nora and found him ready, she didn't comment. She helped Nora up onto the bay's back and mounted behind her, and they went down the mountain together, and the spring mud pulled at every step, and the air had that particular edge of cold and warmth that early mountain spring produces. And Nora talked almost continuously about what she expected Declan Marsh's outpost to look like based on Silas's descriptions. "Is there a sign?" she asked. "No sign," he said. "How do you know where it is?" "Because I've been going there for 8 years. What if you forgot?" "I haven't forgotten." "But what if you did?" "Then I'd find it anyway. It's the only structure within 4 miles. It's not hidden." Nora thought about this. "It should have a sign. Something with a picture on it, for people who can't read." Silas looked at Hazel over the top of Nora's head. Hazel was looking at the trail with the expression she wore when she was not going to comment on something Nora said, because commenting would encourage a longer conversation than the situation required. "I'll mention that to Declan," Silas said. "You don't have to be sarcastic," Nora said, with the accuracy of a child who has been around enough adults to recognize sarcasm even when it's delivered with a straight face. Declan Marsh was exactly what Silas had known he would be. A man of 63 who had made peace with the fact that most of humanity was a disappointment and was no longer taking it personally. He came out of his outpost when he heard them on the trail and stood on the step with his arms crossed and his face doing the specific calculation of a man who is processing an unexpected variable. Silas said, "These are the Rowans, Hazel and Nora. They were caught in the storm and sheltered at my cabin." Declan looked at Hazel, at Nora, at Silas. "You brought people to your cabin," he said. "There was a storm," Silas said. "You brought people," Declan said, as if he hadn't heard, "to your cabin, that you built specifically to not have people at." "Declan, I'm just noting it." Hazel stepped forward. "Mr. Marsh, I have a broken wagon axle and I need access to your forge to fabricate a repair sleeve. I'll pay for the time in labor or trade, your choice. I won't get in your way, and I won't ask for anything else." Declan looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who had listened to a lot of people in his life and had gotten very good at hearing what they didn't say. He looked at Hazel Rowan the way you look at a straight piece of wood, assessing its quality for the purpose at hand. "You know forge work?" he said. 8 years beside a working blacksmith," she said, "plus 2 years after he was gone." "Your husband?" "Yes." Declan was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. "You're going to stay out of my things," he said. "Yes, sir," Nora said, and she had clearly decided to deploy maximum politeness, which was its own tactical choice. "There are items in there that are not toys, not furniture, and not interesting to children." "Yes, sir." "The last child who came through here broke a measuring gauge I'd had for 20 years. "I won't break anything," Nora said. "I'm good with things." Declan looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. Fine, Declan said, and turned and went back inside, which was his version of welcome. Hazel spent 4 hours at Declan's forge. Silas watched for the first hour, watched the way she moved around the space, the way she learned the tools available before she touched the metal, the way she built the fire to the specific temperature she needed, and tested it twice before she put the iron in. She'd brought the broken axle end strapped to the bay's back, and she studied them again before she started, taking measurements with a string and a notched stick she'd prepared at the cabin. The diagnosis had already been made. She'd been thinking about this repair for 3 weeks, and what she was doing now was execution. She fabricated a sleeve, a reinforced collar of iron that would fit over the breakpoint and be fitted with bolts on either side to hold compression. It was not a permanent repair. She was clear about that with Declan, who'd come to stand in the doorway of the forge and watch with the specific focus of someone who knows what they're looking at. It would hold long enough to reach the next settlement with a proper blacksmith, which was about 60 miles west, which, at wagon pace, was 4 days of travel. Clean work, Declan said when she'd finished and held the sleeve up. It'll do what it needs to do, she said. That's what clean work means, he said. She almost smiled, the way she almost smiled at people who said something accurate. He was learning to read the difference between that and the perform smile, the one she put on for situations that required it. He and Declan traded while Hazel cooled the piece. The usual exchange, hides and dried meat for salt, coffee that was actually coffee, a few specific tools he needed. Declan handled the transaction with his customary absence of small talk, and then, when it was done, poured 2 cups of the actual coffee and handed one to Silas without asking. So, Declan said. Don't, Silas said. I haven't said anything. You were about to. Declan drank his coffee. She's a capable woman. Yes. The girl's got her eyes. Yes. Declan looked at his cup. How long have they been at your cabin? 3 weeks. A long pause. You sleeping? Silas said nothing. You look like a man who hasn't slept properly in 3 weeks, Declan said. Which is different from how you usually look, which is like a man who sleeps fine but would prefer not to be awake. Silas set down his cup. Declan, I'm not saying anything you don't already know. Then you don't need to say it. Declan looked at him with the mild, devastating patience of a man who has known another man for 8 years and has very little left to lose by honesty. You've been up on that mountain alone long enough that you've started to think that's the only way things can be. It is the only way things can be. For me. Why? Because of... He stopped. He touched the left side of his jaw, the scar. The gesture so old it was automatic. You know why. I know why you went up there, Declan said. I'm not sure that's still the reason you're staying. Silas picked up his cup and drank the rest of the coffee and put it down. She's going west, he said. She was going west when the axle broke, and she'll go west when it's fixed. That's the situation. Declan nodded slowly. Okay, he said, like the word meant more than one thing. They went back up the mountain in the afternoon with the repair sleeve wrapped in canvas and the trade goods loaded on Patience and Nora asking Silas approximately 1 question every 3 minutes for the entire climb, which he'd stopped trying to calculate a way out of and was simply answering. The sleeve fit the axle. Of course it did. She'd measured twice and cut once, and the fit was snug enough that it required persuasion with a wooden mallet to seat it fully. And when it was done, she stood back and pressed the back of her wrist against her forehead and looked at it with the specific look of a craftsperson who has done a thing right. That'll hold, she said. To the settlement? He asked. Past it, probably, if they're careful on bad road. He nodded. Neither of them said what they were both now aware of, which was that the axle was fixed, the weather was turning, and the reason for staying was transitioning from necessity into something more complicated. The days that followed were the ones he had the least language for. Hazel was up and fully functional now, ribs still complaining but not dictating. She threw herself into the remaining work at the cabin with a kind of focused energy that he recognized in himself when something was ending and he didn't know how to be still about it. She repatched the north wall chinking properly, not just the one section she'd done during the storm, but the full north face, working along it systematically, replacing every loose section. She reorganized his supplies, not intrusively, but in a way that made clear sense that he could follow after she was gone. She mended every piece of clothing that had needed it. His second coat, both of his work shirts, a canvas tarp that had a tear he'd been using folded over to avoid. She did not say she was doing these things for him. She just did them. He found himself doing things too, things he didn't examine the motivation for. He checked the wagon twice and oiled the wheel bearings and repacked the cargo in a way that distributed weight better across the repaired axle. He cut an extra length of good rope and coiled it and put it in the wagon without saying anything. He found, somewhere in his stores, a small jar of the drawing salve that had helped her ribs and put that in too. Nora noticed all of it. He was fairly sure she said nothing about it because she had decided not to, which was a very deliberate choice for a 7-year-old. The night before they were supposed to leave, he sat at the table after Nora and Hazel had turned in, and he looked at his cabin. He looked at the north wall with its careful new chinking, at the mended coat on the peg, at the floor that was clean, that had been clean for 3 weeks now, not from any particular effort, but because 3 people living in a space naturally maintain it better than one person who doesn't see it as worth maintaining. At the table where he'd sat across from Hazel so many evenings over the past weeks, while Nora slept or drew or interrogated the rope horses, the two of them talking or not talking with equal comfort, the fire between them and the mountain holding the night back outside. He sat with all of that. He sat with the memory of carrying her off the roof, the weight of her, real weight, not described or imagined, the actual physical gravity of another person in his arms who needed him to be where he was. He sat with her hands around his cold hands in front of the fire. He sat with the sound of Nora saying, "You're not very alone anymore," in the voice of a child who has decided something is simply true. He didn't sleep that night either. Morning came the way mornings come when you don't want them. Inevitable, indifferent, arriving on its own schedule without consulting you. Hazel was up before him, which meant she hadn't slept well either, though neither of them said so. She made the coffee, which she'd taken over making somewhere around week 2, because she'd watched how he made it, and made a small adjustment to the process that produced something objectively better, and he'd had to allow this, even though it irritated him in a way he couldn't justify. He sat at the table and she handed him the cup, and their fingers didn't touch. "Trail should be good today," he said. "Looks clear," she said. "You've got about 4 hours of easy travel before it steepens near the lower valley. After that it opens up and you'll make good time." "I remember the trail." "The river crossing at Sallow Creek?" "Silas." He stopped. "I know," she said. Not unkindly, not gently either, just directly. The way she always said things. He drank his coffee. Nora came from the corner where she'd been awake for at least 20 minutes, he suspected, lying still and listening. She sat at the table and looked at her oats. Hazel had made oats without comment, the same as every morning, and she ate them slowly, which was the first time in 3 weeks she'd eaten slowly. When the wagon was ready and the bay was hitched and Patience was watching from the lean-to with her characteristic expression of pointed commentary, they stood in front of the cabin in the thin spring morning light, and the moment had the specific texture of something that can't be postponed further. Nora went to Silas first. She walked straight up to him and put her arms around him as far as they would go, which was approximately his midsection, and she held on. He stood very still. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something that could break, though she was, as Hazel had correctly noted, the least fragile person he knew, he put his arms around her and held on back. She said something into his coat. He couldn't hear it. "What?" he said. She said it again, a little louder. "I said thank you for letting us stay." He opened his mouth and nothing came out for a second. "You were good guests," he said finally. She pulled back and looked up at him with her mother's eyes in her smaller face. "You were a good host," she said, with the formal finality of a child closing a chapter she doesn't want to close. Then she climbed up onto the wagon with the determined efficiency of someone who has decided that moving is better than standing still. and she looked at the horizon ahead like she was ready. He turned to Hazel. She was already looking at him. She'd been looking at him, he thought, for at least a minute, with the particular quality of attention she gave things she was trying to memorize rather than just see. "The rope in the wagon," he said. "I found it." "And the salve." "Found that too." He nodded. "You didn't have to—" she started. "I know that," he said. She looked at him. The morning light was doing something specific to her face. The dark hair loose again, the way it always was in the morning. The lines at the corners of her eyes that he'd stopped seeing as age and started seeing as evidence of work done and winters survived and things carried for a long time. He had 12 things he could have said to her. He'd had 12 things he could have said to her for at least a week. He went through them in approximately 3 seconds, and none of them were right. They were all either too small or too large, and what he actually felt was neither. "Be careful at Sallow Creek," he said. "The bank on the east side is undermined. Take the crossing 20 yards north of the trail marker." She looked at him. "The current's not bad this time of year," he said, but the bottom is uneven, and if the bay—" "Silas," she said. He stopped. "Okay," he said. She looked at him for a moment more. Then she stepped forward and she put her hand on the left side of his face. Not the right side, the good side, the side that looked like the face he'd had before. The left side. The scarred side. Her hand against the scar, her palm warm, the same warmth as when she'd held his cold hands by the fire. He stopped breathing for a second. She didn't say anything. She didn't make it into a statement or a demonstration or a lesson about his worth. She just put her hand there for a moment, the way you put your hand on something real, and then she took it away. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it." She climbed up onto the wagon next to Nora. He stood and watched her gather the reins with those capable hands and cluck to the bay, who moved out with the energy of a horse that has been standing in a lean-to for 3 weeks and is ready to go. The wagon rolled forward, the repair sleeve holding clean, the wheels turning without complaint on the mud-soft trail. Nora turned around and waved. He raised one hand. They went down the trail, and the spring light fell on them, and the mountain released them the way it releases everything that was only ever passing through. He stood there long after the wagon was gone from sight. He stood there until he could no longer hear the bay's hooves or the wheel noise, until the mountain had swallowed all of it back into its own sounds. Wind, birds, the creek running fast with snowmelt somewhere below. Then he went inside. The cabin was the same square footage it had always been. Same low ceiling, same fireplace with its perpetual lean toward the left. Same table, 2 chairs, sleeping cot, north wall with its new chinking. The coffee cup she'd used was still on the table. He looked at it. He sat down in his chair. He'd sat in this chair alone for 8 years. He knew exactly how it felt. He knew the specific quality of silence in this room when it was just him and the fire and the mountain and nothing else. The silence was wrong. Not different from before wrong, not changed wrong. Wrong the way a room is wrong when something has been taken out of it that was part of the structure, and you can see the shape of what was there in the absence it left. He sat with it. He was good at sitting with things, except he wasn't actually sitting with it. He was fighting it. He was doing the thing he'd trained himself to do, which was to make the case for why his life made sense, why the mountain made sense, why a man who looked like him had no business wanting the things that other men wanted. He ran through the whole argument, start to finish, the fire, the scar, the woman who couldn't be seen with him, the 2 years in the town that had made clear what the world thought of his face. And he made every point he'd made for 8 years. And then he heard, very clearly, in the memory that has its own acoustics, Nora's voice saying, "You're not very alone anymore." Past tense. Past tense, he realized, sitting straight up in his chair. She hadn't said, "You don't have to be alone." She hadn't said, "You shouldn't be alone." She'd said, "You're not very alone anymore." Past tense, as if it were already done. As if the thing had already happened and the only question was what he was going to do about it. He sat there for another 2 minutes. He thought about 8 winters alone, which had felt like a full life until 3 weeks ago when he'd discovered they had been something else entirely. He thought about Hazel's hand on the left side of his face, on the scar, without flinching, without performance, just there. He thought about Nora holding on with her whole small body, and thanking him for letting them stay, as if the gift had been his to give. He thought about a river crossing 20 yards north of the trail marker, with an undermined east bank and an uneven bottom, and a woman who did not know exactly how bad it was because she hadn't seen it at full spring melt, which it currently was, and a 7-year-old on the wagon behind her. He got up. He didn't think about it after that. Thinking was how he'd stayed on the mountain for 8 years, and thinking was done. He got his coat and his pack, and he saddled Patience in the lean-to. And Patience, who had watched the bay leave with 3 weeks of accumulated resentment, communicated her readiness to pursue at a pace that suggested she had opinions about the recent living arrangements and was ready to discuss them at speed. He went down the mountain. He rode at the pace the trail allowed, which was faster than a loaded wagon and slower than he wanted to go, and he pushed Patience at the steeper sections until she voiced her objections in the specific register that meant she was complaining but complying. The spring mud was not his friend today. Neither was the trail's condition in the lower section, which had been broken up by the wagon wheels ahead of him and required more attention than he wanted to spend on it. He caught himself calculating distance and time and comparing it to the wagon's head start and telling himself he was doing this because of the river crossing, because of the safety issue, because someone needed to show her where the safe ford was. He let himself believe that for about 4 minutes. Then he stopped the internal argument because it was wasting energy he needed for riding, and because he already knew the real answer, had known it since he stood in front of the cabin watching the wagon until it disappeared and felt the mountain close back over the space it had occupied like water over a stone. He hadn't felt the mountain close over his own solitude in 8 years. He hadn't noticed it because it was all there was. This time he'd noticed because there was something specific that the solitude was replacing, and the specific thing had a name and a daughter and hands that knew how to work a forge and eyes that looked at his scar the same way they looked at everything else. Patience found her rhythm on the lower trail, and he let her have it, the mule's sure-footed efficiency doing what it did best. And the spring mountain came down around him as he descended. The smell of thawed earth and cold water, the birch trees just thinking about leaves, the muddy trail showing the wagon tracks fresh and clear. He followed them. He followed them down and around the long switchback and through the spruce corridor and out into the lower valley where the trail widened and the ground began to level, and he could see ahead of him, a quarter-mile down the valley floor, the wagon moving at a steady walk with the bay's dark shape pulling it and 2 figures on the bench. He didn't call out yet. He rode to within 100 yards, and the bay heard Patience. Horses and mules have opinions about each other across distances that seem too far. And the bay's ears went up, and Hazel turned. He saw her see him. She pulled the bay to a stop. He rode up alongside the wagon, and Patience settled into a walk beside it, with the resigned manner of a mule who knows when she's been outmaneuvered by circumstances. Nora was looking at him with an expression he'd seen before. It was the expression she'd had when she'd swept the floor and waited to see if he'd say thank you. The expression of someone who had already decided something was going to happen and was waiting for the adults to catch up. He looked at Hazel. She looked at him. Not surprised. Not performing surprise. Just looking at him with that direct attention, waiting for the honest version. "Sallow Creek," he said. "The crossing." "The crossing," she said. East Bank's not safe." "You mentioned." "I should show you." She looked at him. He looked at her. The valley spread out around them in the thin spring light, the mountains on both sides still white at the peaks and coming green at the lower slopes, the trail running west ahead of them toward a settlement 60 miles away, and a future she'd built herself toward through 2 hard years of carrying everything alone. "You could just tell me where to cross," she said. "I could," he said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm going west," she said. "I know. I've been planning on west for 2 years. I know that too." Another silence, the kind that has a question in it. "Where are you planning on going?" she asked carefully. He looked at the trail ahead, at the mountains around them, at the wagon with its repaired axle and its cargo redistributed, and its rope and its small jar of salve, at Nora watching him with the patience of a child who already knows the answer to the question she's not asking. "I haven't decided yet," he said. Hazel looked at him for a long moment. "That's the first time," she said slowly, "that I've heard you say you haven't decided something." "First time in a while that I haven't," he said. She held his gaze. And this time, what moved in her face wasn't the almost smile or the edge of it. It was the real one, the full version, cautious and real and not given easily, the kind of smile that means something because the person wearing it doesn't hand them out. She didn't say anything else right away. She clicked to the bay and the wagon started moving again, west, down the valley trail. He rode alongside it. They didn't talk for a while after that. The trail ran west and the spring light ran with it, and Nora eventually stopped watching him with that knowing expression and turned to look at what was ahead, and the three of them moved down the mountain together in the particular quiet that falls over people who have already said the important things and are now just living inside the decision. The mountain let them go. It did what mountains do, held its position, kept its own counsel, wore its white peaks like it always had. It had kept Silas Boone for 8 years, and it had done right by him in the specific way that wild things do right by you. It had kept him alive, and it had kept him honest. But it had never, in all that time, offered him what had come down that muddy trail in a broken wagon on the last day before the worst storm of the winter. He looked at the trail ahead. He'd spent 8 years knowing exactly what was behind him and not looking further than the next season. This was the first time in a long time that the ahead of things seemed larger and more real than the behind, and it was uncomfortable and alive in a way that he didn't know yet whether to call hope or just movement. Movement, maybe, for now. That was enough. Patience matched stride with the bay down the last of the mountain trail, and the valley opened up ahead of them, and Silas Boone rode west for the first time in 8 years, following a woman who'd taught him in 3 weeks that the solitude he'd been so certain was his only option had been, all along, just a thing he hadn't found the right reason to leave. He'd found it. It was sitting on a wagon bench in a canvas coat with a mended axle and a sleeping daughter, and hands that knew how to fix things, looking at the road ahead with the steady attention of someone who has already survived the worst and has decided what comes next is worth the work. He didn't know what West held. He'd spent 8 years knowing exactly what each day held, and this was the other thing, the uncertain thing, the thing that required you to trust a future you couldn't see yet. He kept riding. Sallow Creek was running fast and brown with snowmelt, exactly as he'd known it would be. They heard it before they saw it, the specific sound of a creek that has temporarily become something closer to a river. That urgent pushing against its own banks sound that means the mountain is shedding winter as fast as it can and doesn't particularly care what's in the way. When the trail bent around the last stand of birch and the creek came into view, Hazel pulled the bay to a stop and sat there looking at it with the expression she wore when she was revising a calculation. The trail marker was a split post driven into the east bank, and the crossing it indicated looked straight forward on the surface. The creek was maybe 30 feet wide at that point, with a gravel bar visible mid-channel. What wasn't visible was the undermining. He'd found it in the fall, probing the east bank with a pole while checking a trapline downstream, feeling the hollow give beneath the surface crust of packed soil. A wagon's worth of weight on that bank would break through clean. He rode up alongside the wagon and nodded upstream. 20 yards north, the bottom's flat shale up there, holds clean all spring. Hazel looked where he indicated. Then she looked at the marked crossing. Then she looked at him with a very specific expression, the one that said she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to say out loud. A person without local knowledge would have taken the marked crossing, she said. Yes. And the east bank would have given way. Most likely. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. Would the wagon have gone over? He thought about it honestly. The bank drops about 4 feet to the creek bed at that point. With the load you're carrying and the angle, probably, yes. Or the axle would have taken the stress wrong and the sleeve would have failed. She nodded once. She gathered the reins and turned the bay north without any further discussion of what might have been, because Hazel Rowan had always been a person who dealt with what was rather than what almost was. He'd noticed that about her early on, and it had been one of the first things he'd respected. The northern crossing was what he'd said it would be. Flat shale bottom, firm banks, the water running fast but shallow, barely over the wheel hubs at the deepest point. The bay went through it with ears forward and an attitude of professional competence. Patience waited beside them with her characteristic expression of enduring an unnecessary inconvenience. Nora held the side rail with both hands and watched the water move around the wheels with enormous interest and zero fear. It's like the wagon is a boat, she announced. It's not a boat, Hazel said. It's a little bit like a boat. It's a wagon that's briefly in water. A water wagon, Nora said, satisfied, which was apparently the term she'd been working toward. They came out on the west bank, and the trail opened up in front of them, the way it does when you're out of the mountains and onto the lower land, widening, flattening, the trees pulling back and the sky coming down larger on all sides. After weeks in the mountains' close company, it felt exposed in a way that took adjustment, all that open sky pressing down on a person. He'd forgotten about open sky. He'd lived under the mountains' version of it for so long, partial, framed by spruce and granite, that the full version felt like too much information at once. He didn't say this out loud, but he slowed patience slightly and let himself absorb it, the way you let your eyes adjust to a change in light. Hazel glanced at him. She noticed everything. He'd learned that about her. Noticed and filed and didn't comment unless comment was useful. She turned back to the trail ahead. Gets to you, she said simply. After the mountains. All that open. Does it go away? Gets more familiar, she said. I didn't say it goes away. They made camp that first night in a hollow below a limestone shelf that cut the wind and held the heat of the fire reasonably well. It was not as warm as the cabin. It was not as anything as the cabin. Not as sheltered, not as quiet, not as known. He lay on his blanket roll looking up at the night sky through the bare branches of a cottonwood and listened to Nora sleep on the other side of the fire with the immediate totality that children sleep with, and he thought about the cabin sitting empty on the mountain above them. He'd locked the door. He didn't know why. He lived in a place where there was no one to lock the door against, and he'd done it anyway. The way you do things when you're not sure if you're coming back and you want to leave some indication that the place was inhabited by someone who intended to return. He wasn't sure if he was coming back. He didn't think about it further than that tonight. Hazel was still awake across the fire. He knew from her breathing, from the specific alertness that came off a person who was thinking. He waited to see if she'd say something. After a while she did. "What's in the settlement?" she asked. Not to start a conversation exactly, more like thinking out loud in his direction. "Harrow's Mill," he said. 40, 50 families. A proper smithy. Caldwell runs it. He's competent. Grain store, dry goods. A school that operates when they have a teacher, which is not always. She was quiet for a moment. "Is there work?" "Depends on what work." "Blacksmith work. The Caldwell man, is he looking for help or competition?" "He's 68 and his son moved east 3 years ago," Silas said. "I'd call that looking for help, whether he knows it or not." He heard the small sound she made when she was processing something useful. "And for you?" she said. "Is there work in Harrow's Mill for someone who knows trapping and mountain skills?" He hadn't thought about it in those terms. He'd been thinking about Harrow's Mill as a destination for her, not as a place where he had a role. The question settled onto him with more weight than it should have for 6 words. "Probably," he said. "Settlement that size always needs someone who knows the land around it. Scouts, hunters, men who can read weather and terrain. So there'd be a reason for you to be there." "There'd be a practical reason," he said carefully. Another silence. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know. I'm also not going to pretend I don't know why you came down the mountain," she said. "Because I do know, and I think you know I know. So we can skip the part where we pretend it was about the river crossing." He looked at the fire. "It was partly about the river crossing," he said. "Partly," she agreed. "I'm not a man who—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is. I've been alone long enough that I've lost the—" He couldn't find the word. "The habit of it?" she said. "The belief in it," he said. "That it's available to me. That I'm a person it's available to." The fire cracked. An ember shifted. Somewhere in the dark, a night bird made its one-note statement and went quiet. "Thomas was a good man," Hazel said. The shift in subject was not a shift. It was the same conversation. He was kind, and he worked hard, and he loved Nora from the first minute. He wasn't exciting or surprising. He was steady, and I loved him the way you love something steady, which is not the same as loving something safe. Steady is its own kind of hard. She paused. After he died, people kept telling me I'd find someone else. Like it was a lost item, like I'd just misplaced a husband and the next one was around the corner. Her voice was not bitter, just accurate. I stopped believing that people saw what was actually in front of them instead of what they expected to see. A fat widow with a small child and no money heading west. What they saw was a problem, a tragedy, something to be managed. "What were you?" he said. "Someone who knew what she was going to do," she said. "Same as always." He looked at her across the fire. The light moved on her face the way firelight does, making everything both clearer and less certain, and he thought about the woman who had walked out of the trees on the east slope of the Cradle Mountains on the worst day of her recent journey and looked at a scarred man with a rifle and seen something useful. "You looked at me like I was useful," he said. "The first time. On the trail." She almost smiled. "You were useful. You weren't afraid." "I was cold and my axle was broken and there was a storm coming. I didn't have the energy for afraid." Most people have the energy. "Most people haven't spent 2 years doing things they didn't have the energy for anyway," she said. "You get economical about fear. You save it for things that are actually dangerous." "And I wasn't dangerous." She looked at him across the fire. "Were you?" "No." "I know," she said. "I knew it then. I don't know how exactly. I just knew the difference between a man hiding from people because he wants to do harm and a man hiding from people because he's been hurt enough to believe that's the kindest thing he can offer them." He didn't have an answer for that. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about him, and it landed in a place that had been closed off long enough that opening it hurt. "Nora said you hadn't smiled in a long time," Hazel said. He blinked. "When did she say that?" "That first evening, when you were outside getting wood. She said—" Hazel paused, and her voice had the careful quality of someone quoting someone they love accurately. She said, "Mama, I think that man forgot how to smile and nobody reminded him." He sat with that. "She's 7, he said. "She sees things," Hazel said simply. The fire burned lower. He didn't add wood, and neither did she, and after a while they were both quiet in the way they'd been quiet in the cabin on the best evenings. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what had been said was enough, and the silence after it was part of the same thing. He fell asleep eventually, which surprised him. He slept without waking until the first gray light, which had not happened in a long time. Harrow's Mill took 3 days to reach, 3 days of trail and weather that couldn't decide what season it was, and one more river crossing and a stretch of road that had been churned by previous wagon traffic into something Hazel navigated through with focused irritation, and Nora described in elaborate anatomical detail as the wagon bucked through it. Patience developed a grudging cordiality with the bay over the 3 days that expressed itself as proximity without acknowledgement, which was probably the most Patience was capable of. He and Hazel talked through those 3 days in the broken, intermittent way that travel allows. Not long conversations, but the kind that pick up and put down and pick up again. The way two people talk who have decided that they have time for the conversation and don't need to rush the whole of it into a single exchange. He told her more about the years before the mountain than he'd told anyone. She told him more about Thomas, real stories, not the curated version people give when they're protecting a memory, but the full one, including that Thomas had been terrible with money and had once traded a good hammer for a dog that turned out to be half wild and useless, and that Hazel had loved that dog anyway. He told her about his brother Cal, who was alive somewhere east, last he knew, with their mother's eyes and no idea what had become of Silas. She told him that her own mother had been a woman who believed that difficulty was not an excuse and that being female was not a limitation, and had raised her daughters accordingly and had been regarded by the town as aggressively strange. "She sounds like she knew what she was doing," he said. "She knew exactly what she was doing," Hazel said. "She was building us for the life we were actually going to have, not the one that would have been comfortable." He thought about that for a mile or two. "My father built me for nothing," he said, matter of fact, no self-pity in it, which turned out to be its own kind of education. You learn what you actually need when you're not given anything you don't. Hazel looked at him sideways. "Is that why you're good at everything practical and couldn't mend a coat to save your life?" "I can mend a coat." "Your second coat had a tear in the elbow that had been there since at least October." "I was saving it." "For what?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She laughed. Not the almost laugh, not the edge of it. The real thing, sudden and genuine and a little surprised at itself, the laugh of someone who doesn't do it often enough that it comes out a little rough and doesn't care. He hadn't heard her laugh before. Not really. He realized that sitting on the wagon bench with the spring trail running west and the sound of it still in the air, Nora turned around from where she'd been riding in the wagon bed and looked at her mother with an expression of pure delight, like a person who has been waiting for rain. He didn't smile, but something moved in his face that he couldn't fully control, and Nora saw it. And she turned back around without saying anything, which was the most remarkable act of restraint he'd ever witnessed from a 7-year-old. Harrow's Mill arrived as most settlements do, announced first by smell, then by sound, then gradually by evidence of human occupation accumulated along the trail until suddenly it was a place rather than an approach to a place. The smithy smoke was what he smelled first, which made sense, then the grain mill running on its water wheel, then the particular composite sound of 40 families living in proximity, animals, children, tools, voices. He felt the familiar tightening. 8 years had not taken it away, the way the body responds to a thing that has heard it before. He didn't let it show. He rode into Harrow's Mill on Patience's back with his hat brim low, the same way he'd ridden into every place for 8 years, waiting for the eyes. They came. Of course they came. A town this size, 2 strangers arriving with a wagon and a child, that was already a small event, and the people who noticed everything. He saw the moment when eyes moved from the wagon and found him and did the thing they always did. The quick adjustment, the slight recoil, the reorientation away. He'd learned to move through that in the way you move through cold water. You don't stop, you adjust your breathing, and you keep moving. What was different this time was that Hazel was beside him, and Hazel did not adjust. She did not look at him differently when people looked at him. She drove the bay through the main street of Harrow's Mill, looking where she was going, and when she stopped in front of the smithy and climbed down and someone's eyes moved between her and Silas and did the thing where they tried to figure out the story, she handed Nora down from the wagon and didn't offer anyone the satisfaction of an explanation. Nora took her mother's hand and looked around the settlement with her characteristic thorough assessment. Then she looked up at Silas on Patience. "It's smaller than I thought," she said. "Most places are," he said. "Is that good or bad?" "Depends on what you need from it." She thought about this. "I need a school." "There's a school building," he said. "Whether there's a teacher at the moment is a different question." "I'll be the teacher's problem," Nora said, with the serenity of someone who has accepted her own nature. The smithy introduction went the way practical introductions go when both parties have more interest in the work than in the politics of it. Elias Caldwell was 68 years old, built like something left over from an earlier and more demanding century, with hands that had spent 50 years in the forge and showed it. He came out at the sound of the wagon and looked at Hazel the way Declan had looked at her, with the professional evaluation of someone who cares more about competence than biography. Hazel showed him the repair sleeve. He turned it over in his hands, ran his thumb along the weld, checked the bolt seating, put it down and picked up her hand and looked at her palm the way a smith looks at another smith's hands, which is one of the oldest forms of credential. "Who taught you?" he said. "My husband, Thomas Rowan. He worked in Millfield before we came west." "Rowan." Caldwell turned the name over. "Red-haired man? Quick with scroll work?" Hazel stared at him. "You knew him. Knew of him. Reputation came west before he did." He paused. "He died, I heard." 2 years ago." Caldwell nodded once, the way old men nod when they're acknowledging something too large for condolence. He looked at the sleeve again. "This'll hold past the settlement, if you want to know." "I know it'll hold," Hazel said, not unkindly. He looked at her. Then he looked at Silas, the full look, the scar, and all of it, with the blunt assessment of a man who has been working with fire and iron long enough that disfigurement is not a remarkable category of thing. "You're Boone," he said, "mountain man from the Cradle Range. Declan Marsh mentioned you, said you were the most useful man he'd never been able to get to do anything useful for anybody but himself." "Declan talks too much," Silas said. "Declan talks exactly the right amount," Caldwell said. "It just comes out wrong." He looked between them. You people coming to stay or passing through? Hazel looked at Silas. Silas looked at the settlement around them. The houses going up at the north end, the fields being broken at the edge of town, the mill running, the smoke from a dozen chimneys, children he could already hear before he could see. A place that was becoming itself, still in the process, not finished and not pretending to be. Coming to stay, he said. If there's a reason to. There's always a reason, Caldwell said. Whether it's your reason is something else. He turned back to Hazel. I need someone who can work the forge when my shoulder won't, which is more often than I'd like and less than it's going to be. I can't pay wages, not yet. But there's a house on the East End the settlement built for a family that didn't make it through the winter. It sits empty. It'd go to someone who was useful. Hazel was quiet for a moment. He knew what she was doing. She was doing the math she always did, the real math, not just the numbers, but the shape of the situation. What was offered against what was needed against what it cost, and whether the cost was one she was willing to pay. I'd want to work the forge on equal terms, she said, not as help, as a second smith. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. I've got 40-some families who need metal work and one pair of shoulders that ain't what they were, he said. You want to call yourself a smith? Do smith's work, and I'll call you whatever you like. Hazel Rowan, she said. That's what I'd like. That's what you've got, he said. She put her hand out, and he shook it with the gravity of a man who doesn't shake hands lightly, and that was that. The house on the East End was real in the way that frontier houses are real. Walls that met at approximately right angles, a roof that had survived one winter and was optimistic about a second, a fireplace that drew correctly when the wind was from the north and required strategy when it wasn't. There was a small barn attached for the animals, and a yard that had been a garden at some point and wanted to be one again. You could see it in the way the soil was darker in the rectangular sections that previous hands had turned. They stood in the yard in the late afternoon light and looked at it, the three of them. It needs work, Nora said. Most things worth having do, Hazel said. Nora looked at Silas. Can you fix roofs? I've fixed one recently, he said. That's a yes, she said, and walked inside to begin her assessment. He and Hazel stood in the yard. The settlement sounds came around them. Real sounds, people sounds, the sound of a place that was building itself. He'd been away from that sound for 8 years, and it didn't feel the way he'd expected it to feel, which was like too much. It felt like something that had been on the edge of his hearing for a long time and was now, finally, fully audible. You don't have to stay, Hazel said. I want to be clear about that. I meant what I said. I'm not asking you to decide anything based on, Hazel, I'm serious. You came down the mountain and that means something. But you can, Hazel. She stopped. He looked at her in the late light. This woman who had driven a broken wagon through a mountain storm and fixed a roof in a blizzard and worked a forge she'd never touched before and held his cold hands without making it into a moment and put her palm on the scarred side of his face without flinching. Who had never once looked at him and seen what most people saw. I don't know how to do this well, he said. I want you to know that going in. I've been alone long enough that I've got habits that are going to be wrong for this, and I know it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I have habits too, she said. I do things without asking. I fix things that aren't mine to fix. I make decisions fast and change them slow. I know, he said. I have a 7-year-old who asks questions at a rate that should probably concern someone. I know that too. And you're still? Yes, he said. She looked at him, the real look, the full one. Okay, she said. Then, okay. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a declaration or a scene or anything that anyone watching from the outside would have identified as a turning point. It was two people who had seen each other clearly, damage and capability and stubbornness and all of it, deciding that what they'd seen was worth the work. He helped unload the wagon. She directed where things went with the same efficient certainty she brought to everything, and he moved what she indicated without requiring explanation. And Nora helped with the smaller items and described where she thought each thing should go with a thoroughness that was largely ignored but never discouraging to her. That evening they ate from Hazel's stores, dried meat and cornbread that she made in the unfamiliar fireplace with the focused attention of someone calibrating new equipment. And Nora fell asleep in the corner of the new house with her quilt and her rope horses and her absolute trust that the world would continue to offer things worth waking up for. He and Hazel sat at the table in the new house, which was smaller than his cabin table, and whose chairs were not quite the right height, and whose fireplace smoked slightly from the southwest, and they drank the last of the coffee he'd brought from Declan's stores. "The school," she said. "I'll ask tomorrow. If there's no teacher, there might be parents who'd pay someone to teach the children through the season." "Nora can teach herself most things," Hazel said. "She needs other children," he said. Hazel looked at him. "She's spent 2 years with adults," he said. "She thinks like an adult and talks like an adult, and she handles things like an adult. That's not all good. She needs to be 7 with other 7-year-olds. Hazel was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching her. Hard not to." "No," she said. "I mean, you've been watching what she needs, specifically." A pause. "Thomas did that. It was one of the things he was good at, seeing what Nora needed that I was too close to see. He didn't know what to do with the comparison. He didn't know if it was meant as one. He let it rest where she'd put it. "I'll find out about the school tomorrow," he said again. She nodded. The fire settled. The settlement outside had gone quiet, the way small communities go quiet at night. Not the deep silence of the mountain, but the inhabited silence of people who have finished the day's work and taken themselves inside. A dog barked once from the far end of town and then stopped. The cottonwoods by the creek made their sound. "What do you see?" she said. "When you look at this?" She meant the room, the house, the situation. All of it. He looked at it. He tried to see it honestly, the way she would want him to. Not the hopeful version or the fearful version, but the real one. "Something that's going to be hard," he said, "and something that's worth it." "That's my answer too," she said. "Does it scare you?" She considered that genuinely. "Yes. Me too," he said. And that was honest. An honesty between two people who have both been hurt by the world's tendency to promise more than it means. That kind of honesty is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only foundation worth building on. He slept that night in the settlement's spare room. The house had 2, which was one more than the cabin, a fact that Nora had noted with the satisfaction of someone who has been sharing space for 3 weeks and has opinions about it. And he lay there in the dark and took stock of what his life currently contained. A mule with no patience, a woman who fixed things, a girl who saw things, a fireplace that smoked from the southwest, work that was needed and a place that was still becoming itself, and therefore had room for a person who was also still becoming. It was not what he'd planned. He hadn't planned anything for 8 years, had organized his life entirely around the absence of plan, because plan implied future, and future implied hope, and hope was the thing he'd packed away after the fire like a winter coat that no longer fits. Nora had said he wasn't very alone anymore, past tense, like it was already done. She was right. He understood now. It had already happened, somewhere between the broken axle on the east slope and the fever night, and Hazel's hand on his face and the wagon rolling west and all the miles after. It had already happened, and he'd ridden down the mountain not to begin it, but because it was already true, and he'd finally run out of ways to argue with true. The scar on his face was still there. It would always be there. In the morning, people in this settlement would see it and do what people did, and some of them would not get past it, and others would, over time, stop seeing it the way you stop seeing a familiar landscape. It becomes just the shape of things, just the context in which you know a person. He couldn't control which category anyone fell into. He'd spent 8 years trying to control it by removing himself from the equation entirely. He was done removing himself. He was 41 years old, and he had a mule and a trade and a set of skills that this settlement needed, and he was going to be in this town in the morning and the morning after that, and he was going to be the man that Hazel Rowan's daughter told people fix things, because that was what Nora had decided he was, and Nora's assessments had proven reliable. The dog barked again, further away this time, and then the settlement was quiet. He thought about his cabin on the mountain, locked and empty, the north wall chinked clean, the woodpile depleted, the floor swept. He thought about going back for it someday, not to live, but to settle it properly, to thank it correctly for 8 years of keeping him alive while he waited for a reason to come back down. He'd give it a proper goodbye when the season allowed. For now the door was locked, and he was here, and the fire in the new house had settled into coals. And somewhere in the next room a 7-year-old girl was sleeping with the total faith of someone who had always believed that the world contained more good things than bad ones, and had been proven right enough times to keep believing. He closed his eyes. When he opened them it was morning, and through the window he could see the settlement already waking. Smoke from the smithy, the mill wheel turning, a man he didn't know yet crossing the street with a purpose he didn't know yet. And Silas Boone lay still for a minute, looking at all of it with the specific feeling of a man who has come in from the cold. Not fixed, not healed, not transformed into something easier or simpler or without the weight of what he'd carried. Just in from the cold. Warm enough to try again. In the kitchen, he could hear Hazel moving, the particular sound of a capable person beginning a day, the fire being built up, the pot found, the morning organized with quiet efficiency. He heard Nora's voice, still rough with sleep, asking something. He heard Hazel's answer, too low to make out. He got up. He put on the coat she'd mended, the second coat, the one with the repaired elbow, which fit him better than it had in years because she'd taken it in slightly at the shoulder while she was at it, which he hadn't asked her to do, and which was perfectly correct. And he walked out of the room and into the kitchen, and Nora looked up from the table. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. She looked at him with those eyes that missed nothing. She looked at him the way she had that first morning in the cabin when she'd inventoried the room and declared it cozy, assessing, accepting, moving on. "Mama's making oats," she said. "I see that." "We've had a lot of oats." "You have." "I don't actually mind oats," she said with the air of someone making a confession. "I just like to have something to say about them." He sat down at the table across from her. Hazel set a cup in front of him without being asked. Real coffee. Caldwell had given her a small supply last evening as a welcome, and the smell of it was an event. She sat with her own cup, and they were at a table again, the three of them, in a house that needed work in a settlement still becoming itself. And it was not the cabin on the mountain, and it was not what any of them had been heading toward when the axle broke on the east slope of the Cradle Range. It was better. In the specific way that the real thing is always better than the imagined thing. Rougher and more difficult and more true. Nora wrapped both hands around her cup of warm water. She was too young for coffee and had accepted this with philosophical resignation, and she looked at the two of them. "This is a good table," she said. Hazel looked at the table. It was not a good table. It was a rough-cut frontier table with uneven legs and a surface that had clearly been used hard. "It'll do," Hazel said. Nora looked at Silas. He looked at the table. He thought about the table in the cabin, the one he'd sat at alone for 8 years, and he thought about the difference between a table with one person at it and a table with 3. "It's a good table," he said. And Nora smiled at him. The full, open smile that she'd been giving out freely since the first day. The smile that cost her nothing because she had not yet learned to ration it. And something happened in Silas Boone's face that hadn't happened in longer than he could accurately remember. He smiled back. Not a big thing, not a transformed man, all is well, everything resolved kind of smile. Just the real, small, unpracticed version that comes from being in the right place with the right people and knowing it in the bones, in the part of you that has been cold for a long time and recognizes warmth when it finally, stubbornly, improbably arrives. Outside, Harrow's mill continued to build itself towards something. The smithy fire was up, the mill was turning, the spring was finishing the slow work of taking the mountain's winter apart. And at a rough table in a house that needed work, a scarred man and a capable woman and an undefeatable child drank their morning cups and began the ordinary, difficult, irreplaceable work of being a family. Not because it was easy, because it was true. And that, in the end, is the only reason that ever holds.